So I am pleased to welcome you to my talk on the war of the gods and the demons. And I mean that literally, except to some extent a bit about the gods in the plural. And even I mean it a bit about that and not just because of the Trinity. And the reason why is that after the October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and a bunch of similar outfits, my reaction online immediately was Hamas Delenda. And that's because I saw a very clear line between the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage and Israel's and our fight against the death cults today. Not just a historical link, but a spiritual link. And some of you, of course, are familiar with this reference, and others apparently had a public school education. So I should explain to you that in the run-up to the Third Punic War, Cato the Elder, who was not as warm and friendly as this statue might lead you to believe, ended every speech with Carthago Delenda, which means Carthage must be destroyed. And in honor of Todd, it is a passive periphrastic, my favorite Latin construction. And what Cato meant is that it was not enough to defeat Carthage. Carthage was not an ordinary enemy. Rome had defeated all sorts of adversaries over the years and had generally gone on to make friends with them. But he said Carthage is the home of something so evil that good people cannot abide it. They cannot live with it. By the way, I'm sorry, my PowerPoint designs lack a certain something, but I did search historic when I was looking for PowerPoint designs, and I got Pride Month, but I didn't get Caesar. So I didn't not even Elagabalus, so I went with this and rushed back to my notes, which are, of course, on the subject of war. And it's a fascinating topic. It has dominated the study of history. It's also interesting when speaking to a Christian audience because Christians are not the people in the world most likely to be jumping up and down shouting, kill, 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 which is from Alice's Restaurant, the song. As I had occasion to comment to my students, my cultural background is somewhat different than most of the people who attend these conferences. And then I proved it by playing ghost chickens in the sky for them. But it's one temptation among Christians is always to turn the other cheek, to say, you know, as the peace movement bumper sticker I once saw, who would Jesus bomb? But as we are told to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, it's important to come to grips with the fact that war is Caesar's, that defense of the realm is a legitimate activity, and in some sense it is incumbent upon Christians, not that all are called to fight, and not that every war ought to be fought. But I do not think that you can simply watch the barbarians burning the libraries, slaughtering the monks, and raping the children and say, watch me get martyred and go to heaven. I mean, sometimes that's what you have to do. There are circumstances, or, you know, you may be one of the people who's not really in a position to take up a claymore and start hacking away. But, and I remember there's a movie, I've never been able to track it down. It's some World War II movie, largely forgettable, but there are a nun and a priest somewhere in occupied Europe going out to do something on behalf of the resistance. And she says to him, "Here's hoping God loves you, Father." And he responds, "Yes, but not so much that he wants to meet me straight away." And this part of Chesterton's proof that the opposite of funny isn't serious. It's not funny and nothing else. But again, Alfred the Great, who we met on Monday, is a classic example of a Christian ruler who understands that war is a core duty of the state and that he was in a situation where it was something that he needed to devote a great deal of his time to, including defeating the Danes, forcing them to convert to Christianity, recapturing London, reorganizing the navy. This did not make him a less Christian ruler. And again, one of the things about the business with rendering unto God and rendering unto Caesar that is unique to Christianity is that it gives the state a subordinate dignity that is very real. Some religions ask the state to create heaven on earth, and the state cannot do this. This ends up not merely exceeding its capacities, but also making it a disgraceful enterprise. It cannot be otherwise than shabby as well as tyrannical. Others may say that statecraft is unrelated to religion, but this, I think, is not tenable. If you know with some degree of certainty what is right and what is wrong, you cannot ignore it when you approach government. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Douglas tried to get around the question of slavery by saying it didn't matter if it was right or not. And Lincoln skewered him. He said, you can say it is right, but you can't say you don't care if it's right. That gets us everywhere. And of course, the state doesn't just make war, it also enforces the law. And all of this involves the police power, the fact that the state uses violence, and sometimes it uses it rightly in ways that we're called upon to endorse and even assist with. And of course, that doesn't solve the problem either, because the classic criteria of just war, jus ad bellum and also jus in bello, right? And again, we got accusative and an ablative for Todd. I'm doing my best here with my Latin. Whether the war is in principle just, and then whether it is fought justly. And you need both. And sometimes you don't really get them. Or what's worse, it's simple enough. If a war is unjust, you're against it, right? If you were a German under Hitler, you don't support World War II if you can possibly get away with it. But there are wars that are just kind of prudential statecraft questions, and they're not very right, they're not very wrong. And I was thinking in that category of the War of Jenkins' Ear, which has one of the best names of a war ever, but was one of these 18th century wars that, although Jenkins here attempting to show the prime minister his ear, and the prime minister saying, "Do not bother me with this vulgar severed part of your head," was really about Britain's strategic position and what happens to us if we don't respond to the insult. It wasn't a very clear-cut episode. And then I looked up another one with it. After Pope Julius II created the anti-French Holy League in October 1511, Henry VIII followed the lead of Ferdinand of Aragon and brought England into the new league. And there would be a good deal to say about that if any of us could remember a single thing about that war other than that excerpt from Wikipedia. And I'm inclined to think that on the whole, Henry VIII's wars, like everything else about Henry VIII, were bad. But this wasn't one of these wars that was a slam dunk yes. And maybe, again, if I knew anything about it, I'd say it was one we should just have stayed out of. But there are other wars that rise above the fog, where you look at them and you say, this one has to be done. And the clearest example, of course, is World War II. And again, this doesn't excuse everything that happened, and there were things like allying with Stalin that make you wonder. But that war, on the whole, was as clear a struggle of good against evil as you can imagine. And when people argue about World War I, the question, was it in that category or not? I tend to the view that it was. Other people think, no, certainly not. But again, if it was, if World War I really was a war to save civilization from something evil, then it is, at least you know what you have to do, and then you're just stuck with the problem of how to do it. And I'm going to argue in this talk that the Punic Wars were also in this category, that they were not just another war of statecraft, and that the war that's going on now in the Middle East is also in that category, and for very similar, in fact, for reasons that are, on the whole, the same. And again, not every war that's morally justified in purpose and conduct is a holy war. Sometimes a war is a prudent war, it is well fought, but it is just a matter of, on balance, we should do this. On the other hand, some wars are holy wars, and they're holy wars in large measure because on the other side, they're unholy wars. And if we're in one now, we better know it. And as some of you know, last month I was preparing for the Augustine College graduation ceremony, and I've been asked to reflect on one of the students and what it had been like having her at the college, and trying to imagine what might happen in her life, which is quite difficult because life is uncertain and she's young and many, many things may happen to her. But I was thinking that one thing that I can tell about the life of a young person, and of course every year these people get younger, it's quite odd, is that whatever the slings and arrows, that she would in fact find herself in conflict with principalities and powers. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And no sooner had I started drafting this than I got a note from Todd with the conference program, and I was to read from Ephesians. And it was one of these non-coincidences that the internal structure of the universe delivers to you. By the way, it's easy to get corny about coincidences and so forth, direct interventions, but C.S. Lewis once said that, you all knew that verse, whatever men may say, no one really thinks that the Christian doctrine of the resurrection is exactly on the same level as some pious tittle-tattle about how Mother Égaré Louise miraculously found her second best thimble by the aid of St. Anthony. And so there are some things in this world that are not really signs. And then there are other things that are part of the deep metaphysical and moral structure of the universe. And I think this one might have been in the latter category. And it's interesting too, again, as some of you know, I was not raised in the Christian faith. I was raised by Protestant atheists, and I got a lot of cultural literacy. But we didn't read the Bible. And one of the curious results of that is that on finding Christ or having Christ find me, a lot of Bible verses to me are fresh. Like they're not, oh, that again. I heard it 1,000 times, first heard it when I was 4. And sometimes I think that's a good thing. Sometimes a bad thing, because my actual knowledge of Bible verses is terrible. But when I got that line from Ephesians, I tried to read it as though none of us had ever heard it before, as though I were reciting as Paul wrote it, that this sudden, dramatic, hugely important piece of urgent advice about the world was coming to us, and we must understand that we are fighting principalities and powers. This isn't just a phrase, this isn't just ritual, it's not just something carved in marble. It's really what's happening. And again, that too may seem somewhat corny. I think it was Lewis again who said, it's one thing to tell people you believe in Jesus, and quite another to say you believe in devils. But as Lewis also said, the devil's greatest achievement is convincing men he does not exist. And if you're wondering what this has to do with Hamas, we're getting there. And we're getting there via the War of the Gods and Demons, which is Chesterton's chapter title in The Everlasting Man about the Punic Wars. And I read a good deal of this in my class, so Kaylin can do something else while I go through this. But one thing I didn't know at the time, I only just found this out catching up on my Gilbert magazines, is that The Everlasting Man was an answer to H.G. Wells' The Outline of History. H.G. Wells being a materialist, progressive, typical of the late Victorian world. And so he was a materialist. To him, there's no morality. History is the product of impersonal forces. And to Chesterton, as to me, history is the product of personal forces, that it matters what we do, it matters what we think, and some of the persons involved here are not human persons. This is a much more exciting story full of actors, some of whom are on your side, and thank goodness, and some of whom are not on your side, and look out. And part of Chesterton's argument here, because he's setting up the incarnation, or rather he's commenting on the setup to the incarnation, that Christ comes into the world and teaches and is crucified and resurrected in the Roman Empire. And that isn't because God got lucky, that while he was cooking up the incarnation, the Romans were conquering much of the known world, and thus happily it turned out that is actually part of how the whole thing fits together, because that was the right stage for this most dramatic act in the whole of the play. And if God's ways of arranging things are more powerful and subtle than we can understand, that should be the least surprising thing I say in the course of this evening, since he is God. And so here Chesterton is arguing that he's got these two civilizations that know little of Judaism and aren't fighting over it. The Punic Wars are not to do with anybody's thoughts about Israel. Some Romans knew about the Jews, of course, as a conquered people who were an administrative headache that just never seemed to go away. I think they regarded them as a stiff-necked people, including, as they would then discover with the Christians, they won't just say, yeah, okay, there's lots of gods, ours is one, we'll all go to the temple of Jupiter. But if you had told the Romans at the time of the Punic Wars that the Messiah of Israel is going to change the world and convert the empire, they would have regarded you as one more lunatic. Even if you tried to tell them, and the critical point is there's just one God, they might have looked at you funny, though I'm not so sure about that. One of the interesting aspects of Rome and the coming of Christianity is that the Romans had realized, by and large, that their religion was stupid. And that's an important part of the story, too. They were ready for a religion that made sense, because the Olympian religion doesn't make sense. Jupiter seducing women as a swan or a shower of gold is not fit for adults. And they knew it, because they were adults. The Romans were very grown up. Almost a little too much so. And, you know, we don't even really know what the Romans thought for various reasons, including that, of course, they didn't have a codified set of scriptures. They did not have an agreed set of holy books. We have these weird sources, some of which are fairly plainly satirical, from which we have tried to reconstruct what the official story was, except there isn't just one official story. It's not a matter of some people getting the story of Europa wrong. There's different versions in different places, and none of them are canonical. And again, as it is, can be difficult sometimes to see the Bible as though you were hearing it for the first time. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount. Again, if you try to clear your mind and imagine him saying the meek will inherit the earth, and you're thinking like George Carlin, well, if they do, how hard will it be to get it back from them? I mean, this is astonishing stuff. We take it for granted. The equation of holiness with weakness. God is a baby. Yeah, there's the crush again. Well, it's really awe-inspiring. But other religions are not. Christianity is not the template for religions. There are other religions that have agreed canonical holy books, but they're not that common compared to the total number of religions that have ever existed. Also, the Bible is really remarkable in that it is a story. And it's like, yeah, sure, fine, right? God creates the earth, covenant with Israel, promise of Messiah, prophets lament sin, Messiah arrives, tells people what to do, gets crucified, rises from the dead, and at the end you get Revelation, and this is how it all ends, with a thunderous bang, and you're like, okay, sure, of course. But not even the Quran is anything like that. The Quran is edited from longest to shortest verses. Seems odd. There's so much about Christianity that is odd. The Romans, in addition to having no orthodoxy, didn't have a theology. Right? There aren't Roman theologians. What's there to talk about? This would have been a really miserable job, even if it had existed. And here's where I stop insulting the Romans and start praising them on behalf of Chesterton, was that there was a spirit to their religion. And again, it is a common mistake among people who study comparative religion and become comparatively religious, that all religions are essentially the same. Different hats, different rituals, shoes on, shoes off, this kind of thing. But all of that is profoundly superficial, and at heart, all religions are saying the same thing. And this is not true. I mean, even God is love. That is something that really only Christians say, right? God loves, yes, lots of religions say that, some don't. I don't think the Aztecs really felt that way about their gods. Or you used to get these, right after 9/11, you got a lot of people saying what Islam needs is a reformation. It's this historicist, everybody's on the same path, they're just 700 years behind. But of course, the opposite was true, because the trouble with medieval Catholicism in the eyes of many people is it was too centralized. But the trouble with Islam, or one of them, is it's too decentralized. Remember when the Ayatollah Khomeini pronounced a fatwa against Salman Rushdie, and then he died before they could kill Rushdie. And people said, okay, well, how do we get rid of this fatwa? This thing's an annoyance. And there's no way. There's no centralized authority that can say, X that one out. So again, you don't want to think about all religions as being the same, including all paganisms. Now, again, I said we don't really know what the Romans thought, and I don't just mean we don't know what the priests thought about Jupiter and his thing with the swan. What the ordinary Roman person thought about religion, or what the ordinary Egyptian thought about religion, may be vastly different than anything you'd ever hear in one of their temples. I mean, Christians hold a lot of different views, don't they? Some of them legitimate debates about scripture, others a bit off the wall. If some peasant pockets the host and cuts it up to scatter it over their vegetable garden, this is not orthodox in any normal sense, but it's certainly a belief grounded in some way in Christianity and in the efficacy of the sacrament of communion. I mean, the Romans had the lares and the penates. And I think the lar is kind of cool, but I won't expand on that because I can't really remember what the lar was. Did ordinary Romans believe in an afterlife? Did they believe in punishment of the wicked? And I tend to assume that despite Roman mythology presenting the afterlife as worse than this world, which took some doing, that most people have always had a kind of sense of, oh yeah, they're oppressing us now, but just you wait. One day there will be a judgment, and the haughty and the cruel will get theirs, and we who are haughty and cruel will be given some kind of reward. I assume most people have always thought that. It's written in the human heart. But again, it's hard in scouring Roman sources to be very sure about it. But though we don't know all that stuff, we do know that by their fruits ye shall know them. And the fruits of Roman religion tell us something about the nature of their belief system, which is, on the whole, the Romans, and they had all the usual follies and foibles and nasty aspects that human beings have, but generally the Romans were better than their philosophy. They were better than their theology. People who said life is totally meaningless and then you die would go around as though honor and truth and justice were hugely important. And that's a good thing. That speaks very well of them, in my opinion. And again, I think it's one of the reasons they were getting so suspicious of their religion by the time of Christ. Nothing in the Olympian religion can possibly give you any reason to behave. I mean, occasionally they say, yo, Zeus protects travelers or something like that. But it's like, really? I saw 10 of them dead on the way here and nobody cared. You know, that's a bit of a stretch. But at the same time, there's this strong sense somebody should protect travelers. It's not okay that people just get robbed and slaughtered. That's not how the universe ought to be. And part of this complex miracle of the incarnation is this meeting of Athens and Jerusalem and Rome, that the revealed religion comes together with critical philosophy so that very shortly after the incarnation, you get Paul and his letters, and you get systematic theology of a sort that we would now feel swindled if any religion failed to produce. Even religions like, Scientology will give you a theology. I mean, you can give it back to them and say, no thanks. But nevertheless, they wouldn't dream of not offering you something. There's a thing I also found in we've been reading Harry Lee Poe's biography of C.S. Lewis, and that at one point Lewis made this remarkable observation that would appear several times, that the death of the gods into allegorical figures had not happened because of Christianity, for the dissatisfaction with the old gods had been growing since the time of Socrates. Lewis said that, quote, monotheism should not be regarded as the rival of polytheism, but rather as its maturity. And there is a good deal of truth to that. The Romans were ready for Christianity because they knew Jupiter was past his cell date. And so did many Greeks, from Xenophanes to Colophon, who, I'm going to see which of my guys this is, one of whom said, Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods everything that is disgraceful and blameworthy among men, theft, adultery, and deceit. So the Greeks had noticed that their gods were a bunch of bums. And the problem is, what do you do with that? And you need something better. And when Paul comes along with his unknown God, they're like, oh, at last, this weirdo from wherever that place was just cracked it for us. That's amazing. Came to scoff and stayed to listen. But there are polytheisms and polytheisms. And so to call monotheism of the Christian sort the maturity of polytheism is to talk about a certain kind of polytheism, but not about all of them. And when I do my History of Western Civilization course, we get to our fifth lecture, and four was Greece. And I say, now we come to the Mediterranean civilization that took over from Greece, if I may use that term, and instead of a brief flash of glory and a pair of peninsulae, created an empire that lasted 1,000 years and dominated the known world. I refer, of course, to Carthage. No, wait, I don't. The Greeks, after getting kicked around by the Macedonians, are supplanted by the Romans, who come to help and stay a while. And though they lack the Greeks' theoretical elegance, they're grimly practical. And they're saying if the Greeks wanted to know the distance from Athens to Rome, they would measure it from the stars. If the Romans wanted to know, they'd send a legion to pace it out. But part of the point of that story is that the Roman legion would do it, and they'd do it right. They wouldn't get drunk and then make it up. They would actually pace it off and come back with a number that was correct. They also, therefore, while the Greeks talked about liberty until they were ready to exile you without cause, the Romans came up with Civis Romanus Sum, a very practical statement. I am a Roman citizen, with practical legal consequences, like I was talking about the writs in Britain. Well, you remember the story of Paul. They're about to scourge him in the unpleasant ways that the Romans were quite good at, when he says, is this how you treat a Roman citizen? What? And suddenly it all stops, right? You can't do that. I mean, they could have killed him and buried the body, but they weren't that kind of people. And they actually governed the empire quite well. And so people have been studying Rome on and on and on. I mean, Robert Conquest in his Reflections on a Ravaged Century about you have to have perspective on the past. And then he said, the present writer can plead that he's a long-standing member of the Society for the Promotion of Roman Studies. And yeah, in a real way, you can't understand the modern world without knowing about Rome, but you actually can understand it without knowing a lot about a lot of other places. And I don't want to be rude about a lot of other places. But again, as I bring up in the course early on, this line, whoever can lift as much as a Wen-ho is himself a Wen-ho. And this goes when nowhere, because we don't know that Wen-ho is this super Chinese strongman like Hercules. We've all heard of Hercules, right? Because the Romans had heard of Hercules, and therefore, well, he was Heracles. So all of this stuff gets passed down to us, but why? And the answer in part, to go back to this thing about setting the stage, Rome is a universal empire, not the whole world, but most of the known world is either controlled by the Romans, or else, you better watch out if you annoy them, and they do know where you live. And though that's nothing compared to the church that is to come, but you cannot lay Rome the church on top of Rome the empire unless you have Rome the empire, right? The Christian religion conquers this universal empire and persists and develops and gives us the modern world because by accident or by design, there is this enormous, spectacular, hugely successful civilization that adopts the faith in large measure. And, even if you're not Christian, Rome is fascinating. People, including because it eventually falls. First, the Republic falls, and then the empire falls. And it has this terrible sense, like we can see it coming and we can't stop it. And Benedict XVI at one point wrote, Europe is infected by a strange lack of desire for the future. Children, our future, are perceived as a threat to the present, as though they were taking something away from our lives. Children are seen, at least by some people, as a liability rather than as a source of hope. Here it is obligatory to compare today's situation with the decline of the Roman Empire. And I thought, oh, obligatory, okay, try that on the modern school child, and they'll be lucky if they know where Rome is. They will not have thoughts about the Roman Empire and its decline. But nobody says, well, we're in trouble here. It reminds me of the Mughal Empire, or whatever happened to Benin. People don't go around asking that, whereas somebody did a survey and was astounded to find that people think about Rome 5 times a day. But not even people in China are wondering what happened to the Bling dynasty. And we know a lot more about Rome. I mean, presumably you know something about the Legion and the Pilum and the Gladius, or maybe you don't. I'm sorry. I did go to a school whose chant started Themistocles, Thermopylae, the Peloponnesian Wars. But by and large, people have heard of the Roman Legion more than they have of the Greek phalanx. But one of the critical things about Rome, and this was also true of the Greek city-states, is that The Romans were citizen soldiers, and they created a military force that was enormously more powerful than any other kind of organization, because liberty is power. So I was also going to come up with this thing about the Roman story being a story that we better pay attention to, because it's also our story. And if you remember the Pirates of the Caribbean, okay, some people see the Pirates of the Caribbean where the heroine is just refusing to believe her eyes as she discovers that the pirates are ghosts. And then Captain Barbossa dramatically tells her, "You best start believing in ghost stories, Miss Turner. You're in one," and steps out into the moonlight and becomes a skeleton and so on. Well, this one goes the other way around. We're in a Holy Ghost story, so it goes from bones to flesh. But it's still, you better pay attention because we're in one. And again, why not Carthage? What is Carthage's story? How does Carthage fit into the story? Why didn't Carthage, or someplace we can't even remember, supplant Greece? And are we here going to invoke H.G. Wells' impersonal forces and conjure up some explanation of how this obscure city-state takes everything over? Or are we going to believe that there was some element of design in this, that Wells only saw the surface, the material surface, and he missed the spiritual core of it all? And this is why we're going to ask Chesterton, because in this part of The Everlasting Man, he makes as direct a claim as I think I've ever seen for the hand of God in history. And I find it very convincing. I mean, I know the story of the Angels of Mons, right? So the British are retreating at the beginning of the First World War, and the Germans are chasing them, and it's all falling to bits, and the angels appear and stop them. Only it's not really very well attested, and I think it probably didn't happen. The Punic Wars certainly did happen. And again, we're looking at a world in which nobody's heard of anything, but I think most people have heard of Hannibal and his elephants, right? That's a reference you're fairly safe with. Even though apparently nobody's heard of the Black Hole of Calcutta. Not everybody knows that Hannibal in Phoenician means grace of Baal, and Hannibal Barca, grace of Baal lightning, and Baal is a Phoenician deity, and Hannibal is the Carthaginian general, blah, 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 blah. And the funny thing is that he's kind of a sympathetic figure. Lost causes have a certain romance to them, and so Hannibal getting his elephants across the Alps, this is, as you imagine, is not a contemporary picture. This is a picture from 1866, which implies that he was something of an idiot as the elephants go tumbling into the abyss. This is not how you'd want to do it. But again, it's all part of a story of history that people really did know. Again, I may have quoted to you before this thing. Josephine Tay wrote this book, The Daughter of Time, which is a vindication of Richard III, in which her protagonist, a policeman named Alan Grant, gets a serious back injury. So he's stuck in hospital bed and bored. I mean, he sees a picture of Richard III, and he doesn't look like a villain. And so he starts doing a cold case investigation. Did he really murder the princes in the tower? And at one point, he gets this sort of historical reader, and he says it bore the same relation to history as stories from the Bible bears to Holy Writ. Canute rebuked his courtiers on the shore. Alfred burned the cakes. Raleigh spread his cloak for Elizabeth. Nelson took leave of Hardy in his cabin on the Victory, all in nice, clear, large print and one-sentence paragraphs. And he comments that this is the kind of history that people remember after they've forgotten tonnage and poundage, ship money, Laud's liturgy, the Rye House plot, and the triennial acts. Including the princes playing in the sunlight in the ominous Tower of London. And again, I don't think anybody ever forgot Laud's liturgy today because nobody ever heard of it. But in Josephine Tay's youth, the cab driver would have known about Laud's liturgy and was probably against it. Anyway, all that's gone out the window now. But we once had this image of Romulus and Remus, Caesar and his assassins, Horatio on the bridge, Caligula's horse, Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Again, I don't know if you're familiar with Louis Jordan. He's a saxophone player, one of the precursors of rock and roll. He's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And he does a song, which you couldn't do today, called Isn't That Just Like a Woman? And it refers to Marie Antoinette, and it refers to Nero. And it's just filled with historical references. And he just assumed that everybody in the audience would know exactly what he was talking about. Although, let's be fair, we don't actually believe that Rome was founded in 753 by twins who were suckled by wolves. This is thought to be an Etruscan image with the twins added in the 15th century, unless it was the whole thing was cooked up in the 13th. So nobody really knows. But it's interesting that the Roman mythology starts with a fratricide and then a city that's formed by strangers, many of whom are scruffy vagabonds. Is part of Rome's image of itself as an open society that better watch out or it's going to kill its brother with a shovel, right? It's an interestingly humble founding myth. Rome did exist, of course, but it was a minor player in this collection of Greek colonies throughout the Mediterranean. And in 400 BC, if you've been asked to pick the one that would be the universal empire, picking the Romans would have been an eccentric act, to put it mildly. And again, if you look at the Celts and their expansion, you're maybe betting on them. You're not saying one day Caesar will be Augustus or any of that sort of thing. And Rome was sacked by the Celts in 387 BC, but, you know, things keep going on. And you get, in 264 BC, you get the first of the Punic Wars, the whale versus the elephant. Rome here's the elephant, despite Hannibal. Carthage being the sea power, Rome being the land power. And then you get the second Punic War, which is the one with the elephants. And again, I don't know that you would have bet on Rome even to win that war, which they very nearly didn't, let alone to become a universal empire. And on the way, of course, they pounded Carthage in the Third Punic War, which, by the way, it looks a bit unfair in some ways. Like, by now, Rome clearly has the upper hand. Why couldn't they just leave the Carthaginians alone? And again, as an aside, if you mention Hannibal today, odds are, among young people, they'll be thinking of Hannibal Lecter. And in a way, appropriately, I remember an old journalistic colleague of mine at the Ottawa Citizen once said the Dirty Vicar is the best news story there is. And that's because of the hypocrisy of those who are meant to be in charge of our society and can't even abide by their own teachings. And I thought, yeah, but now it's the mad psychiatrist, right? Hannibal Lecter really is a man for our times. But having said that, I want to come back to why, in the Third Punic War, Rome forced a fight and then sowed the ground with salt. They really did. I mean, it's not just an expression, right? The Romans plowed the fields around Carthage with salt so nothing would grow. Why on earth did they do this? And why would we be, as I'm suggesting we should be, on the side of the Romans as they carry all this out? I would say we have to get to the heart of the matter, and ideally not by ripping it from someone's chest to appease or bribe the gods, which you probably weren't thinking of doing, but lots and lots of religions did that. And it's kind of important that we don't live under a regime that is motivated by that kind of thinking. So years ago, I was at the Ottawa Citizen, and I asked the library to do some research for me on Carthage to make sure that I hadn't got the historical reader version, not the actually true version of all of this. And they said that they didn't have a lot of sources. Their religion had Baal and Tanit as central gods, but there were also elements from Greek religion with the goddesses of Demeter and Persephone. The religion of the Carthaginians involved rituals with human sacrifice. What? Like, wait a minute, 1 minute we've got Persephone, and the next minute we're slaughtering people for ritual purposes. That's a bit of a jump. And then they found me something that said, human sacrifice was the element in Carthaginian religion most criticized. Oops, sorry, we're not there yet. Gosh, really? And the child victims were sacrificed to Baal, not to Moloch, and the burned bones buried in urns under stone markers or stelae. And then, so we've got another source here. I think this is the next one is a Catholic encyclopedia. Although this sensual and sanguinary religion inspired the surrounding nations with horror, they nevertheless imitated it. Hence, the Hebrews frequently sacrificed to Baal in the mountains, and the Greeks adored Astarte of Sidon under the name of Aphrodite, and Baal Melkart of Tyre under the name of Heracles. Well, yes and no. The Greeks were not into human sacrifice. They occasionally did it, but they never did it without feeling very, very bad about it. I was struck by the word nevertheless. And again, when you read the biblical accounts where some king did not cut down the groves, and the prophets are in high dudgeon, and you're thinking, but I like trees. The thing is, they knew, and their audience knew, that what happened in the groves was human sacrifice. It's only mentioned a couple of times. Once in a while, one of them spells it out. But they all know what they're talking about, that these are rituals where humans are sacrificed to obtain things from the gods, and these are an enormous abomination. And it's not because they don't feel horror that they imitate it, it's because they do feel horror, that they feel that this transgression will get me power. It will bring me favors from terrible gods. It will take shortcuts through all the hard work of life and land me what I really want. And here we do finally get to Chesterton. So one more standard history, that in spite of these deficiencies and a cruel religion that demanded blood sacrifices, Carthage had a civilization superior in luxury and scientific attainment to that of Rome. Well, okay, I guess that's fine then, sacrifice human beings, get money. What the heck, let's party. There's something wrong with this. There's something very wrong with this. And again, I do think it matters. And Chesterton, when he's setting this up, he says this materialist theory of history, that all politics and ethics are the expression of economics, is a very simple fallacy indeed. It consists simply of confusing the necessary conditions of life with the normal preoccupations of life that are quite a different thing. And if you leave things like all the religious wars and all the merely adventurous explorations out of the human story, it will not only cease to be human at all, but cease to be a story at all. And I often think of this when people talk about companies wanting profit. Yes, companies want profit the same way people want oxygen. It's not like our life is a quest for oxygen. It's just that it's really, really hard to take the next step if you can't breathe. And as Chesterton also points out, in any case, no man will die for practical politics, just as no man will die for pay. Nero could not hire 100 Christians to be eaten by lions at $1 an hour, for men will not be martyred for money. And he said, of myself and those I knew best, I can answer for the vision that made surrender in the First World War impossible. It was the vision of the German emperor's face as he rode into Paris. This is not the sentiment which some of my idealistic friends describe as love. I am quite content to call it hatred, the hatred of hell and all its works, and to agree that as they do not believe in hell, they need not believe in hatred. See, and there's a sudden link between these abstractions and the very practical business of winning World War I despite everything. And Chesterton's brother was killed in the war. So he was speaking of something where he had suffered a personal loss. And he then goes back to Carthage and says there's a religious war when two worlds meet. That is when two visions of the world meet, or in more modern language, when two moral atmospheres meet. And this is what we must understand, even at the expense of digression, if we would see what really happened in the Mediterranean, when right athwart the rising of the Republic on the Tiber, a thing overtopping and disdaining it, dark with all the riddles of Asia and trailing all the tribes and dependencies of imperialism, came Carthage riding on the sea. And people don't talk like that in history books anymore, which is one reason nobody studies history. I think it's marvelous, but it's also, I think, very profound. That this is a war between two incompatible visions of the world that go right down to the roots of things. And Chesterton also says where the Greeks had a natural turn for the mythology, the Latins seem to have had a real turn for religion. And Greek polytheism kind of branched up like a tree, but Italian polytheism went down like roots. And that the Italian cults have a local and domestic character with a god of roofs and a god of gateposts, a god of doors, and even, this being the Romans, a god of drains. They would have one. But then he says, the truth is that the only men to whom the family is sacred will ever have a standard or status by which to criticize the state. They alone can appeal to something more holy than the gods of the city, the gods of the hearth. The spirit that lifted Rome from beneath was the spirit of all the Romans, and it is not a cant to call it the ideal of Cincinnatus passing from the Senate to the plow. Men of that sort had strengthened their village on every side and had extended its victories already over Italians and even over Greeks when they found themselves confronted with a war that changed the world. And of course, lots of historians think war is important, others don't. Herodotus, the father of all things. But the idea that it would change the world because of its moral qualities is one that is far less likely to appeal to them. But this is where Chesterton says, I have called it here the war of the gods and demons. There was established this new town, that's what Carthage means, with this strange spirit to it. In the previous chapter, I've hinted at something of the psychology that lies behind a certain type of religion. There was a tendency in those hungry for practical results, apart from poetical results, to call upon spirits of terror and compulsion, to move Acheron in despair of bending the gods. There was always a sort of dim idea that these darker powers will really do things with no nonsense about it. In the interior psychology of the Punic peoples, this strange sort of pessimistic practicality had grown to great proportions. In the new town, which the Romans called Carthage, as in the parent cities of Phoenicia, the god who got things done bore the name Moloch, who was perhaps identical with the other deity whom we know as Baal, the Lord. And again, on those rare occasions when the Greeks or Romans practice human sacrifices, because they're so desperate that they need practical results, and they need them in a hurry, and they say the demons deliver in a way that the gods do not, immediately and thunderously. And this is, superficially, he agrees with the materialist view. He says the worshippers of Moloch were not gross or primitive. They were members of a mature and polished civilization abounding in refinements and luxuries. They were probably far more civilized than the Romans. And Moloch was not a myth, or at any rate, his meal was not a myth. These highly civilized people really met together to invoke the blessing of heaven on their empire by throwing hundreds of their infants into a large furnace. And again, not somebody else's infants, as bad as that would be, their own. Remember what he said about the family is the only thing that can rally people against the state, a feeling that the family is sacred. And if you're sacrificing your own children to Baal, it's not because you don't recognize the sanctity of the bond and the responsibility of parents to children. It's because this is the greatest sacrilege you can imagine, and this will bring the dark powers. In return for that, they will reward you because they really want that kind of thing to happen. And so then Chesterton comments, it is common enough to blame Rome for not making peace with Carthage, but it was a true popular instinct that there could be no peace with that sort of people. Not because of ethnic drawbacks or anything of that sort. They're human beings with the same defects we all have. People who believe in that kind of religion and practice it. There can, somebody once said, people have small ideas, but big ideas have people. Nothing matters more than someone's metaphysics. And the metaphysics of Carthage were such that you could make no peace with it. And another interesting point that he makes, it's common enough to blame the Roman for his Delenda est Carthago, Carthage must be destroyed. It is commoner to forget that to all appearance, Rome itself was destroyed. The sacred savor that hung around Rome forever, it is too often forgotten, clung to her partly because she had risen suddenly from the dead. Remind you of anyone? But it's true, Rome was losing. Hannibal really had them on the ropes. They were losing the Second Punic War. They're fighting in Italy. Carthage is across the sea, being unbothered by this war. Although there is a classic story when Hannibal is camped outside Rome, and some Roman pays a premium price for the land the Carthaginian camp is located on. The Romans were not easily discouraged. But it is really remarkable that Rome didn't lose the war. Rome should have lost the war. Rome was beaten like Britain in 1940, maybe even more so. And as Chesterton again says, as if to make the world's supreme test as terrible as possible, it was ordained that one of the great houses of Carthage should produce a man who came out of those gilded palaces with all the energy and originality of Napoleon coming from nowhere. Hannibal, the grace of Baal. True great armies sank to the right and left of him into the swamps of the Trebia. More and more were sucked into the horrible whirlpool of Cannae. More and more went forth only to fall in ruins at his touch. The supreme sign of all disasters, which is treason, turned tribe after tribe against the falling cause of Rome. And still the unconquerable enemy rolled nearer and nearer to their city. And following their great leader, the swelling cosmopolitan army of Carthage passed like a pageant of the whole world, and the grace of Baal went before them. And at this point, the story should end with Carthage's victory. And in fact, we probably wouldn't remember Rome. It was just one more minor obstacle in Carthage's rise to world domination. But instead, The Romans will not quit. It was no mere military defeat. It was certainly no mere mercantile rivalry that filled the Roman imagination with such hideous omens of nature herself becoming unnatural. It was Moloch upon the mountain of the Latins, looking with his appalling face across the plain. It was Baal who trampled the vineyards with his feet of stone. It was the voice of Tanit the invisible behind her trailing veils, whispering of the love that is more horrible than hate. The burning of the Italian cornfields, the ruin of the Italian vines were something more than actual. They were allegorical. They were the destruction of domestic and fruitful things, the withering of what was human before that inhumanity that is far beyond the human thing called cruelty. The household gods bowed low in darkness under their lowly roofs, and above them went the demons upon a wind from beyond all walls, blowing the trumpet of the Tramontane. The door of the Alps was broken down, and in no vulgar but in a very solemn sense it was hell let loose. The war of the gods and demons seemed already to have ended, and the gods were dead. Now, I don't need to tell you that if I had inserted such language in my doctoral dissertation, I would not today be a PhD in history. People don't talk this way about history, and they don't think this way about history. To almost any historian today, this would be absurdity. This would be nonsense on stilts. And yet I think that Chesterton captures first the way the Romans viewed the war, what they saw as the consequence of their defeat, and why it must not be allowed to happen while one Roman could still bear arms. But I'm also going to suggest to you that the Romans were essentially right, that this really was a holy war, because although the Roman religion was not holy by our standards, it was benevolent, it was domestic, it did not practice human sacrifice, and the Carthaginian religion was truly evil. That these are principalities and powers, not allegorically, but actually. And if that's the case, this is not a war you can duck. This is not a war you can say, let someone else fight. This is a war where you hop out on one leg if you haven't got two to stand before the enemy. And then Chesterton goes on to explain that the reason that Carthage lost was that they were these cold, hard, practical people. They thought Rome was beaten. They could not imagine Rome continuing. Who would fight on? And then he says, why do men entertain this queer idea that what is sordid must always overthrow what is magnanimous? That there is some dim connection between brains and brutality, or that it does not matter if a man is dull so long as he's also mean? Why do they vaguely think of all chivalry as sentiment and all sentiment as weakness? They do it because they are, like all men, primarily inspired by religion. For them, as for all men, the first fact is their notion of the nature of things, their idea about what world they are living in. And it is their faith that the only ultimate thing is fear, and therefore that at the very heart of the world is evil. They believe that death is stronger than life, and therefore dead things must be stronger than living things. Whether those dead things are gold and iron and machinery, or rocks and rivers and forces of nature, it may sound fanciful to say that men we meet at tea tables or talk to at garden parties are secretly worshippers of Baal or Moloch. But this sort of commercial mind has its own cosmic vision, and is the vision of Carthage. It has in it the brutal blunder that was the ruin of Carthage. And he goes on to say, the Punic power fell. I'm going to read a bunch of this because I couldn't say it nearly as well. Because there is in this materialism a mad indifference to real thought. By disbelieving in the soul, it comes to disbelieving in the mind. Being too practical to be moral, it denies what every practical soldier calls the morale of an army. It fancies that money will fight when men will no longer fight. So it was with the Punic merchant princes. Their religion was a religion of despair, even when their practical fortunes were hopeful. How could they understand that the Romans could hope even when their fortunes were hopeless? Their religion was a religion of force and fear. How could they understand that men can still despise fear even when they submit to force? How should they understand the mind of man who had so long bowed down before mindless things, money and brute force, and gods who had the hearts of beasts? They awoke suddenly to the news that the embers they had disdained too much even to tread out were again breaking everywhere into flames, that Hasdrubal was defeated, that Hannibal was outnumbered, that Scipio had carried the war into Spain, that he had carried it into Africa. Before the very gates of the Golden City, Hannibal fought his last fight for it and lost, and Carthage fell as nothing has fallen since Satan. Again, this is not the materialist view of history, is it? But you think perhaps of Britain fighting on after the fall of France, and you see the same kind of spirit. that there's something in the free societies and in Christendom that does not submit to brute force, that does not measure the dragon before fighting it. And this is why the Romans sowed the fields around Carthage with salt. Again, Rome came to stand alone in the midst of an empire because she had once stood alone in the midst of a ruin and a waste. After that, all men knew in their hearts that she had been representative of mankind, even when she was rejected of men. And there fell on her the shadow from a shining and as yet invisible light and the burden of things to be. Again, the suggestion here is that there is something prefiguring Christ in Rome and its triumph over Hannibal that is critically important. As he also says, Carthage fell because she was faithful to her own philosophy and had followed out to its logical conclusion her own vision of the universe. Moloch had eaten his children. The gods had risen again, and the demons had been defeated after all. But they had been defeated by the defeated and almost defeated by the dead. And again, this stuff is frankly embarrassing to people of worldly minds. To say that you believe that there were supernatural things at stake in the war between Rome and Carthage is to portray yourself as a hick. But if that's where to the truth leads you, then be a hick. Get a piece of straw. Go with it. Because again and again, this spirit triumphs over the spirit that believes that the British will surrender at Dunkirk. It is astonishing. This thread really does run through so much of history. And certainly the fact that as things turned out, Christianity comes in the Roman Empire. And again, Chesterton points out that, God is not, Malaldil is not a beast that we can turn from his purposes. It is not for us to guess in what manner or moment the mercy of God might in any case have rescued the world. But it is certain that the struggle which established Christendom would have been very different if there had been an empire of Carthage instead of an empire of Rome. We have to thank the patience of the Punic Wars if in after ages divine things descended at least upon human things and not inhuman. Europe evolved into its own vices and its own impotence, and move on, but the worst into which it evolved was not like what it had escaped. If the Romans were ruthless, it was in a true sense to an enemy, and certainly not merely a rival. They remembered not trade routes and regulations, but the faces of sneering men, and hated the hateful soul of Carthage. And if you go into a store on Valentine's Day and see little cupids and the arrows and these strange, like cute panda-like remnants of Roman mythology, it is because, as he said, the Roman religion was not like the Carthaginian one. If the passage from heathenry to Christianity was a bridge as well as a breach, we owe it to those who kept that heathenry human. If after all these ages we are in some sense at peace with paganism and can think more kindly of our fathers, it is well to remember the things that were and the things that might have been. For this reason alone we can take lightly the load of antiquity and need not shudder at a nymph on a fountain or a cupid on a valentine. Which would not be true if images of Tanit were still around. We would shudder at those, and we would be right to do so. Or you get the Percy Jackson stories, which some of you may have encountered, with what if the Greek and Roman gods were still around and seducing mortal women and having demigod heroes, and then they go to Camp Half-Blood and they have all these weird adventures. Well, the Roman gods are not really that admirable. They're not good parents, for one thing, but they're not like the gods of Carthage. You cannot write charming pagan stories about Baal and Tanit and that crowd. And so, in a weird kind of way, this practicality of Rome comes not from ruthlessness, coldness, and hardness, but from the opposite, from the fact that the heart of Rome is hopeful in a way that the heart of Carthage was not. Now, of course, Rome is still with us in many ways. I presume we recognize Julius Caesar here, fuming at the antics of Asterix and his Gauls. Maybe you don't, but we do remember all of this stuff. We have months named for Romans. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to mention, shortly after the Punic Wars, there's a brutal social war in Italy between Rome and its allies, and it's about as unsocial as you can get. It's very bloody. The Romans win an overwhelming victory. And then they go to their defeated former allies and say, hey, how'd you all like Roman citizenship? Which is more or less what they'd been fighting for in the first place. They make peace with these people, they bring them into Rome, and the result is a very, very positive one. But and again, we remember Cleopatra, we know about crossing the Rubicon. They all conjure up images in our minds, and they're kind of safe, funny ones. I mean, Julius Caesar is not the nicest guy, perhaps, but you couldn't do Asterix with Hannibal. It's a whole different world. And again, you think of other things that we remember from Rome. For instance, the dominant people in the north of England were these Celtic warriors called Brigantes, right? So we still remember brigands. The Roman enemies were these people causing chaos and despair. Well, then they fought the Vandals, right? And it's like if the Vandals drop by, you're not happy. You're like, call me a legion. Palace comes from the Palatine Hill, where the nice houses were. A focus is a fireplace. Emperor is from Imperator. And Caesar, the title Caesar, or if you're German, Kaiser, or if you're Russian, Tsar, right? All of this stuff. I think you remember that Caesar was killed on the Ides of March. And say what you like about Caesar, apparently his last words were an extremely complicated witticism. I'm told by a friend who would know that he did not say et tu brute. He said Kaisu paide, which is the same thing in a sense in Greece, you too, my son, but it is also a reference to a king who is being deposed by his son, telling him, you too, my son, will have a taste of power, as in, you're going to get yours from the same sort of treacherous source. And of course, Brutus quickly discovered that it was true. And Rome takes over the civilized world, and they have this unbearably complicated civil war. Like if I really hated my students, I'd try and make them memorize this, or I'd ask them what happened to the Treaty of Paris, another cruel question. But the result of all this nonsense, Cleopatra and the Asp and Mark Antony and so on, is that under Claudius, you get this. This is an empire such as the world will not see again until Britain in the 19th century. Not only in its extent, this isn't just ball, in the fact that the Roman Empire was so well governed, that they were so opposed to oppressive taxation and corruption, that most people, as soon as they were conquered by the Romans, went, yes, they're much better to have the Romans ruling you than whatever idiot you had before that. By the time of Trajan, the empire looks like this. And the Romans also, they have this severitas, right? They have these qualities of piety, gravity, constance, firmness, discipline, industry, and frugality, sternness with oneself, right? You know what would be really useful for? If you became Christian. Again, you're really going to want to have these qualities. These are ideals that are much more fertile ground for Christianity than the cultures in which extravagance, like the thing about Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Mark Antony, the knock on him was always he was kind of Asiatic. And, dissolving a pearl in wine just to show that you could do it. You can't imagine Cato the Elder having anything to do with this, or Cincinnatus. The Romans maybe exaggerated their virtue. All kinds of things happen that I'm not going to get on about because time is short. But I will mention the line in the sand. Again, this is another expression that comes down to us from Roman times. That is, as you know, you draw a line in the sand, people don't cross it, but why not? And the answer here is that a king, one of these pompous characters, Antiochus IV of the Seleucid Empire, was invading Egypt at a time when there was nobody there to defend it but one elderly Roman consul, Gaius Popilius Laenas. And so he wanders out into the face of this huge Asiatic horde, and he draws a circle around the king on the ground, and he says, before you cross the circle, I want you to give me a reply for the Roman Senate. And the king looks at this guy, and he looks at the line, and he thinks to himself, if I make war with the Romans, they will send legion after legion until I am dead. And he went back home. He let it be, because you knew that the Romans kept their word. The Romans were honorable people. And at one point, Caesar comments that the Gauls, for whom any trifling success made so vainglorious, were just as easily frightened by the slightest reverse. The Romans aren't like that. They are very organized people. I want to put in a few good words for the Romans. The Romans fought like professionals, in silence, organized, relentless. Chomp, 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 you die. They also had this extremely organized structure. The Romans were good at bureaucracy in the positive sense, if there is one. They even had IKEA camps. The camps were done by the numbers, and the parts were organized and labeled. And when you got there, they put it together with the Allen key, and there was the Roman camp, wherever they happened to be. They even had a Swiss Army knife, or Helvetica exercitus cultro, as apparently would be the translation. Amazing people in all kinds of ways. And very self-critical. Tacitus, the Romans make a desert and call it peace. This was written by a Roman historian. He put that line into the mouth of an enemy of Rome to criticize Roman foreign policy, not the way they did things in Carthage. They had codified law, not as good as ours, but they did have these supposed 12 tables, and they actually put them up in a public place so you could see what the law was. A well-governed place, again, the story of Paul and Quibus Romanus Sum. Like, if it was anybody they just wanted to wallop, it was Paul, right? It's just like, seriously, shut this guy up and do it fast. But they won't. Their law says otherwise, and they obey their law. And another thing, which is very worth noting, and again, it helps to explain why they accept Christianity, that in the process of dealing with foreigners, the Romans had noticed, as everybody does, that foreigners are weirdos. They don't do things the way you do them because they're idiots. And so we have Roman law, which is very complicated, and if you mess up one word, the whole contract's invalidated, and it's how everybody's always done it, and then somebody else does this, somebody else does that. And at one point it starts to dawn on them that, maybe there's some things that everybody does. And then there's some things that are just weird local peculiarities. And maybe the weird local peculiarities are a distraction from the universal values, even ours. Maybe it's actually the stuff everybody knows, like not murdering people and not stealing, that are the core of a law that is not just made up on the spot in somebody's hut. And our little bits and pieces that are so odd are actually the stuff that's not so important. And therefore, you get Cicero, who is a Stoic and does not necessarily believe in God at all, but he says, true law is right reason, consonant with nature, diffused among all men, constant, eternal. It needs no interpreter or expounder but itself, nor will there be one law in Rome and another in Athens, one in the present and another in time to come. But one law, and that eternal and immutable, shall embrace all peoples and for all time, and there shall be, as it were, one common master and ruler, the God of all, the author and judge and proposer of this law. As it were, well, maybe take those words out. And as John Patrick used to say to me, how can there be law without a lawgiver? A question that in the end I was unable to answer without accepting the hint he was gently giving me. But you can see for the Romans too, they know this. There is such a thing as natural law. Constant, eternal, binding on all, immutable, coming from a lawgiver. And then you look at Zeus and you're like, no. And you mess around with all kinds of cults in Rome and they do strange things. But one group over and over again comes to you with an answer that you can actually believe and not die of embarrassment, which is that a dead Jewish carpenter's God, which you'd think would make you die of embarrassment. But in fact, the Romans are ready for this. And again, the Romans were acutely aware of the fact that they were rustic bumblers compared to the Greeks when it came to the arts, right? The Romans were so unsophisticated that when they realized there was a problem, they started buying art from Greece by weight. Well, that's not going to help, is it? But at one point, Virgil writes, others no doubt will better mold the bronze to the semblance of soft breathing, draw from marble the living countenance, and others plead with greater eloquence, or learn to measure better than we the pathways of the heaven and the risings of the stars. Remember, Roman, to rule the peoples under law, to establish the way of peace, to battle down the haughty, to spare the meek. Our fine arts, these forever. This is a civilization that may well feed Christians to lions, the emperors would like that, but this, we are going to spare the meek. This whole spirit is incredibly different. And again, there's a lot that's wrong in Rome, bread and circuses, all sorts of cruelty, but we can't look away from it. National Geographic. No one can doubt the impact of ancient Rome on Western civilization and how its influence still endures. And then they try to tell you that Agrippina was a master strategist and hardball politics were off limits to women, yet she did this, that, and the other, who got murdered. Well, I mean, let's be honest. If you'd had Agrippina around, you'd have been fiddling for the poison in the ring, right? This woman was extremely dangerous and not in a good way. But nevertheless, you know, the feminists have to rescue Agrippina. They don't have to do anything with the Queen of Carthage. Yet the Romans, for all this talk of mercy, crush Carthage ruthlessly because Carthage is not that sort of place. The Carthaginian religion is of the demons and not of the gods. And so I've taken up most of my time talking about this, partly because I think it's really important to establish that such a thing can be. That a war can be a battle of good against evil and not in an allegorical sense. That it can really be the case that when you look across at your enemies and all, you know, may God have mercy on all souls, but there are things in those ranks that are not your human enemies. And people like Adolf Eichmann are not merely confused. Something far more sinister is going on. And that is where I'm going to move very quickly now through the entire Middle Ages, Renaissance and all that stuff, and on to Jerusalem. Because remember, the West used to be Christendom, and this spirit survives and continues on, and we get that disastrous civil war of the West in some sense in 1914 to 1918, despite which the West does things like get rid of slavery. And in that war, as you know, General Allenby enters Jerusalem as the first Christian ruler in nearly 1,000 years. And because of World War I, coming out of some very duplicitous Allied diplomacy, the British promised to restore the Jewish homeland. They also promised the land to the Arabs, so it was not, again, one of these things where you'd really want to put in your memoirs everything that had been said and done. But this is where Israel comes from. And by the way, the First World War is the last official jihad proclaimed by a caliph. The Ottoman caliph declared the war a jihad on behalf of the Kaiser against the West, which might give you a pretty good way of judging jihads as a moral phenomenon. And now, Carthage was a Phoenician colony. The Phoenicians are Canaanites. The Canaanites are Philistines. We've come full circle. We have come full circle to a war of those who love life against those who love death, against those who cherish the hearth and those who do not. Remember, Golda Meir had this line, that we will have peace when the Arabs love their children more than they hate ours. She didn't even ask them to love the Jews' children, just to love their own children more. But, you know, you get all this, oh, I am raising suicide bombers, I hope they die. This is not just a bunch of rhetoric that somebody thought would sound good on TV. This is breathing a spirit that goes back to Carthage and beyond, and with which it is impossible to make peace of any sort. Baal wants to destroy Israel and then move on to the followers of the Messiah. But it's not just a weird coincidence. This is what's at stake in this war. It's between those who openly declare their love of death and those who declare their love of life. Another of Golda Meir's lines, I think she said, is that we may be able to forgive the Arabs for killing our children, but it will be difficult to forgive them for forcing our children to kill. And again, you don't hear that kind of thing coming across the fence from the other side, along with the rockets. Yahya Sinwar, the architect of this October 7 massacre, he was actually a prisoner in Israel. He got lethal brain cancer, and Israeli doctors saved him. And what does he do with that gift? He's eventually released in a prisoner swap. And again, the Israelis make these hugely one-sided prisoner swaps because to them life is sacred. Whoever saves the life of one Jew, it is as if he had saved the whole universe. And the Palestinian side does not think in those terms, not even remotely. And remember, on October 7th, and this is not the first time, Hamas and its associates, including Islamic Jihad, and I have days where I want to say, look, once you said jihad, you don't have to say Islamic, and I'm not even sure the reverse isn't also true. They filmed what they did. They took cameras with them, they filmed it, and they posted it online. Even the Nazis took some care to hide what they were up to. These guys showed the world and said, this is who we are. This is our spirit. This is what we will do over and over again, thousands and thousands of times. And when we're done with Israel, we're coming for Europe and North America, and we will do it there too. They desecrated corpses and they boasted of it. They sacrificed humans for dark power. This is the spirit of Carthage, and it is a spirit with which you cannot make peace. And it's extraordinary how many people in the West are siding with it, including the Queers for Palestine. And you think to yourself, don't they know that Hamas kills homosexuals? And the answer is, of course they know it. This is not despite the fact that it is sacrilege. This is deliberately committing sacrilege. This is a death cult of the most sinister, imaginable sort. And again, you could say a lot of bad things about Louis XIV and his wars, but you can't say that he practiced human sacrifice. You cannot say that he set up death camps. The Kaiser didn't actually do it, but after the war, he said, we were betrayed by Jews. I think we need an international effort to get rid of them, and we should look into poison gas. So you're getting somewhat deeper in with the Kaiser. But Hamas carts severed heads around. One woman, they raped her, sliced off her breast, and tossed it back and forth as they killed her. This is not just another enemy that you might fight over control of the spice trade in the Malacca Strait. This is something hugely different. And, if you read the founding Hamas charter, and it cites the protocols of the elders of Zion, it fulminates against Freemasons and Rotary clubs. It's insane, but it's worse than insane. And one of the things you may notice about the Islamists is they always think they're winning, even though their position is terrible. Somebody said of Yasser Arafat that he had a chronic tendency to try and take the pot with a pair of fours. But it's because they believe the dark powers are about to deliver for them. This is not a metaphor. This is not an exaggeration. This is what they sit around thinking is actually happening. The Hamas charter, ye are the best nation that has been raised up unto mankind. Ye command that which is just and forbid that which is unjust, and ye believe in Allah. The transgressors shall not hurt you unless with a slight hurt. Want to bet? Also, Israel will exist and continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. And it also says, all this is utterly serious and no jest, for those who are fighters do not jest. And there are a number of other things that I could get into, but the critical one, here. So there's the Roman one. Yeah, this is the one, Article 7. The Prophet, Allah bless him and grant him salvation, has said, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews, when the Jews will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. Only the Garkad tree, evidently a certain kind of tree, would not do that because it is one of the trees of the Jews. And this is related by al-Bukhari and Muslim because they are two of the four main collectors of the sayings of the Prophet, the Hadiths. This is from Muhammad, supposedly. And there are the groves again. The very trees are coming to life to exterminate the Jews in the final apocalyptic genocidal war. This sort of thing does not come from God. It comes from a very different supernatural being. And this is why this is a war in which there can be no peace. It's certainly with the people if they change their minds, if they relinquish these beliefs, of course, that would be a very welcome thing. But with these beliefs, there can be no peace. There can be no coexistence. It is not that kind of thing. These are principalities and powers. And I said at the beginning, geopolitics is a tool. War and statecraft are often practical things, but there are times when they're not. There are times when we are not making a pragmatic judgment, whether we stand with Israel wholeheartedly, half-heartedly, or not at all. And by the way, then I found this map. This is the countries, the green countries have recognized Palestinian statehood in response, essentially, to the massacres of October 7th. These are the places that thought to themselves, Baal is mighty, and we should go along with this. This is a reward to Hamas for what they did. And then the countries in gray, which you'll notice are pretty much the old Roman Empire, minus the parts that Islam conquered, have not, at least not yet. And I can't leave this without saying that the Christian record on Jews is mixed and in many respects very ugly. We cannot pretend that Christians have always gotten it right. They have often gotten it dreadfully wrong. And that is something that is a source of great shame and pain. But it's been much less true lately. And that, I think, is a very good thing. And it is something that we absolutely must now make sure is where we stand. This is not like the war in Vietnam. This is much more like World War II, and perhaps even more so. There are times and places for prudential judgments. We have decisions to make, the war in Ukraine, how Israel should fight. Of course, all of these things must be dealt with, and dealt with rationally and with as much charity as well as intelligence as we can manage. But I say that in this conflict, all Christians must stand with our elder brothers in Christ against Baal, because we know who and what he is. He is the Lord of the flies. That's why I say Hamas Delenda.
There are many pundits, and everybody has their own particular theories as to how worldwide support for Hamas has grown to such levels in terms of intersectionality, the oppressed versus the oppressor. As you have thought about that, what are your thoughts as to how this is how we seem to garner such widespread support in the face of horrendous atrocities?
I think it indicates that the kind of ideology that makes that connection when this happens was already on a very dark path. That one of the things that has always bothered me about this oppressed versus oppressor stuff is that it commits many of the very sins that it supposedly fights against, including being bigoted, disliking some people because of their race, excusing violence on the grounds of a greater good, saying that death will lead to a new and better world, not mine, but someone else's. And all of these kind of things just click together. I mean, I think one of the things that's frightened people, and rightly, is the way in which so many of the elite institutions in particular automatically want to side with Hamas. All these professors tweeting out resistance by any means possible, right after October 7th, before they had time to think, assuming it wasn't even really controversial. And then having trouble walking it back, in some cases going, wait a minute, what did I just say? But in other cases, doubling down. I mean, and again, a classic case, Fred Hahn, right? This public sector union official here, who is, and he's very proud of this, he's the first gay head of this union, right? And at the same time, he's totally pro-Hamas. And he goes down to the encampments wearing his trademark pink and saying, you know, let's hear it for the Islamists who would kill me horribly if they had half a chance. This didn't start suddenly on October 7th. He wasn't a completely nice guy with an ideology that was pure and noble and saw man in the image of God until he suddenly went, hey, it was great what they did. And all these feminists, right? You'd think of all the things that a feminist would be against, the way Hamas treated the women they captured on October 7th would be at the top of the list. Nothing could be higher. And again, I've described one atrocity, and I'm sorry if it gives you sleepless nights, but there are some things we have to face. I won't mention the others, but you can find out if you want. People who don't balk at that were already in deep trouble morally and mentally. And again, you know, I talked on Monday about these ideologies that tend to cohere at one pole or another. We think about people who were Stalinists in the 1930s. They, again, were dealing with dark powers. I mean, officially atheist, of course, but still justifying, denying, hiding the Ukrainian Holodomor, which many Western journalists did, and even some Western clerics. There is something going on there that is not simply a matter of having not noticed, of having had the facts hidden from you by some cunning plot. There was a willingness to side with the darkness. And of course, again, we're all sinners, right? We all have ways of doing this, and very often they sneak up on us, right? They give us some obvious temptations. We're like, I'm not going to fall for that. And meanwhile, they've got us from another angle. So it's not a matter of, and these people are bad and I'm good. It's a matter of the certain ideas come from the realm of darkness. And the more you dabble in them, the more they get hold of you, until you are in a position where it is very, very hard for you to get out again. And it can be done. There are cases of people who repent even at the last minute, but it is much safer not to go there to begin with. And again, I'm suggesting that certain political ideologies are inherently wrong, inherently wicked. And that's not to turn the partisan debate that's going on Parliament Hill into me crusading against agents of Satan. That would be preposterous in all sorts of ways. But there are some ideas. I mean, Nazism is a case in point. There was no good way to be a Nazi. There weren't good Nazis and bad Nazis. And people go around saying, oh, you know, communism, well, Stalin wasn't a real communist, and oh, if only Trotsky had lived, or, you know, Lenin didn't intend this and that sort of thing. It won't do. These ideologies are just profoundly evil. And when someone says all white people are racist, there's no good way to say that. And it leads into all kinds of absurdities, right? We say, well, you could never understand my point of view because I am non-white and you are white. The obvious answer is, well, then you can't understand my point of view, right? Often, logically speaking, these things are very, very weak, but they get a grip on people in other ways, and then they exert themselves with spectacular mental gymnastics to deny the obvious, which I think is a warning sign. Orwell's line that there are some opinions you'd have to be an intellectual to believe, no ordinary man could be such a fool. And it's one of the ways in which intelligence is like strength. You know, it is not a virtue. It is a quality, useful if used properly, but very dangerous if used badly. And intelligence used against oneself is extremely dangerous. And so people like Lenin are not just more dangerous to the world because they're smart, they're more dangerous to themselves. As also, I mean, one thing about Hitler that often goes unremarked, but it is significant, Hitler was extremely brave, almost reckless in his courage. And that's bad because he used it in ways that we really wish he hadn't. It wasn't good that Hitler was brave, it was terrible. But the number of people who endorsed Hamas and are still saying Israel's carrying out a genocide in the West, in Gaza. And you say, look, Israel has had complete control of Gaza for a long time. At any moment, they could have wiped out the inhabitants. They could have turned off the power, they could have turned off the water, it would have been over in 3 weeks. If the Jews were trapped in an enclave with Hamas having its finger on the buttons, they would have killed all the Jews. This is not hard to figure out. Yet people say Israel's carrying out a genocide, the Palestinians just want peace. They're not making an intellectual mistake, they're making a moral mistake. And then it has intellectual ramifications. You need to wrap it in these things. But at bottom, the IDF appears to have achieved a combatant to civilian ratio in Gaza of around 1 to 1. Under the most appallingly difficult conditions of urban warfare that you could ever imagine, against an enemy that does not wear uniforms or identify themselves, that deliberately tries to cause civilian casualties. This is the least bloodthirsty war, I think, that's ever been waged. This is not in a gray area where you could say, oh yeah, well, maybe Israel's not quite that bad. This is a very different matter. And remember, there's a cartoon that's been around for a long time that shows an Israeli soldier and a Hamas PLO guy shooting at each other. And the Israeli has a woman with a baby carriage behind him with the Israeli flag, and the Hamas guy has a Palestinian woman with a baby carriage in front of him. And that is the way things are there, in the most extraordinary manner. And if you won't see it, it is rarely because there's something wrong with your eyes. I grant there are people who don't know, right? There are people who know nothing about what's going on in the world. It has never been their concern. There were people when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they didn't know there was a Japan, right? And that's, in some sense, they get a bit of a pass on not pushing for preparedness before the war. Something like 1 in 6 Canadians don't know there are these university encampments. So again, they can't be held completely accountable for what they don't think about them, although they could arguably regard it as not paying attention. But the people who do know, the people who really understand this stuff, these colonization studies professors who are advocating policies that would result in a second Holocaust, and it doesn't take a whole lot of brains to see it, are not just making an abstract intellectual mistake because they read the wrong book. And so I mean, and it shades, right? There are beliefs that are just a mistake, and there are beliefs that are a bit of a mistake with a bit of moral taint, and there are ones that are 50-50 and, 75-25. But especially after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism doesn't strike me as being in the gray area. It is just amazing to me. And I mean, I've seen people go out and interview some of these protesters who are chanting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," and saying, which river is that? And I don't know. Which sea? Galilee? Okay, so again, this isn't quite the same as organizing the Wannsee conference to get the final solution administratively tied down. But there are people who do know. There are people who cannot pretend they do not know or should not be allowed to try. And again, that's the thing about people have small ideas, like whether you prefer spicy food or non-spicy food or something like that. But big ideas have people. And if you let a big idea get a hold of you, if you let the demons in, it's very hard to get them out again, which is one of the reasons why you just shouldn't take that chance. Like, why take that risk? What possible good can it do you? Unless you believe it's going to give you this power. If you think you're making this dark trade that the Carthaginians were making. But even that, of course, is a loser bargain, right? Remember, again, Chesterton says the devil's a gentleman and he doesn't keep his word. If you sell your soul, you do not get a bargain. And I think there's something very much like that involved in some of these movements. Hitler once said that the purpose of his mass demonstrations was to impress upon the very little man that though he is but a worm, he is part of a great dragon. And again, if this is a kind of deal you're willing to make, you better watch out, because it's not allegorical. It's real.
It seems that when you were talking about the Romans versus the Carthaginians and sowing salt, that seems like they were trying to eliminate them with like extreme prejudice. Wasn't salt quite expensive back then?
Yeah, this was a very serious undertaking with a very serious purpose. It took a lot of salt, right? And it's going to rain and it's going to get washed out. Like this is not undertaken lightly. But they were determined that this civilization would not rise up again and menace them. And again, you contrast that with how the Romans treat so many of the people that they conquered. I mean, the Romans conquering Britain. And again, my British ancestors, though apparently some of my ancestors were actually Saxons, which it makes it worse. But the British could be quite a handful. But when the Romans conquer Britain, they govern it well, they govern it peacefully, they extend benefits to people, and they get this huge Romano-British class, of which King Arthur is probably the last active defender. They treat the Britons very well. So like a tenth of the legions were in Britain defending it throughout the prime time of the empire. And when the Saxons show up, they wage something approaching a genocidal war on the Celtic inhabitants. Nobody's sure quite how bad it was. Did they just leave them out for the crows and wolves? There's a strong case that they did before being evangelized and suddenly turning around and miraculously becoming defenders of liberty. But the Romans didn't go around sowing places with salt. When they conquered Greece, they didn't trash the place. They felt inferior to the Greeks, and they said, "Teach us, please, so we can be less, tripping over our tongues all the time." And I think it might even be Caesar who talks at one point about this, saying, "We Romans are never ashamed to take something useful from another people. If they have a better habit than ours, we adopt it." What they did to Carthage was a real exception, and it was done because they felt that something was there that was not there in all these other places and that could not be tolerated. And again, it brings me back to the prophets talking about the groves. And you feel the intensity of their loathing and how they despise the rulers that don't cut down the groves. This isn't about gardening, right? This is about these very, very crucial moral issues of two kinds of religion. And it's one thing for people, again, among Christians, if you belong to one particular branch of Christianity, you believe that other Christians have certain things wrong. If you're a Christian, you believe that Jews didn't notice that the Messiah came and that they should probably have caught that, as many indeed did. But this isn't the same as saying they're worshiping Baal. This is a totally different category of within a wholesome and healthy tradition. And again, Chesterton takes it back to the Roman religion, which obviously, for a Christian, somebody worshiping Mercury is getting themselves in a lot of trouble here. But it's not the same as worshiping Tanit. That love more terrible than hate. That's a very, very powerful way of putting it, I think. And so the Romans conquer all kinds of people, and by them, they bring them into the empire, and maybe a little too much so at certain points, and all kinds of things happen. But that spirit of going to all that trouble, that never again will an ear of corn grow where these people once sacrificed children, is a very different kind of thing to do.
So where are things at right now as Israel got into
Rafah? The tanks have reached the center of it now. And I'm sure part of this, they really want to find Yahya Sinwar. They would very much like to get a hold of that guy. But again, if they do get him, they'd want to take him alive. They're not going to stick his head on a post, whereas you know what the Hamas would do to Netanyahu. But I mean, their problem is partly that there are still a few intact Hamas battalions, and they need to wipe it out, and partly because it's hard to fight these wars because you're not exactly sure what would constitute victory. I mean, Americans had something of a similar problem in Vietnam, not as bad. But at the same time, they know they can't leave the job half done. This is a case where the enemy will return to what they were doing. I mean, again, you look at those tunnels in Gaza, and as people have pointed out, think of all the good that could have been done with all that aid money, all the construction. They could have built a Singapore on the Mediterranean, and what do they do instead? They made terror tunnels longer than the London Underground. They put everything into killing the Jews, even if it meant they died as well. And that is not a spirit you can bargain with. That is not a spirit you can deal with. Even, look at even post-war Japan trying to demilitarize it. That was a bit of a long shot, but it did kind of work. There was a sort of a sense that this was a civilization that had somehow gone wrong. But it wasn't devil worship. It didn't feel that way. Although, again, the Japanese and the kind of atrocities they committed were very, very dark things. But with Hamas, it must be uprooted and it must be destroyed. It must not be allowed to revive, because it will revive in the same terrible form. And another thing that I would mention here, every now and again I see Jews will be protesting about this and saying, why? Why don't they understand that our hospitals are open to Palestinians? Why don't they understand that we want peace? Why don't they understand that we hire them, that we want them to be our friends? Why don't they see how good we are? And my answer to them is, they do see it. They don't hate you even though they know that. They hate you because they know that. This is a no-holds-barred evil philosophy. And it loathes you because you are good, not because you are not as good as you wish that you were. That has nothing to do with it. And again, this is not something the materialist mind can wrap around, really. And it's one of the reasons people keep thinking, oh, the Palestinians want peace because then they could have money. Yahya Sinwar is not in it for the money. I mean, the Hamas leadership are billionaires hanging out in Qatar, and obviously, there's a martyrdom is for losers in their view. So there's something, again, a bit hypocritical there. But again, so we need the money so we can run the resistance, right? We are the brains of this operation, and we must control it from a position of not being dead. But this whole idea, like with Yasser Arafat, and Clinton offered him practically everything, 95% of the West Bank, capital in East Jerusalem, and he walked away without even making a counteroffer. The whole point with Arafat was not to make peace and make it seem like the other side's fault. And when that became impossible, he rejected peace even at the cost of being obviously responsible. And did it hurt him with the kind of people who support him? No, I mean, he knew his audience, as Hamas knew their audience when they published this stuff online. And people thought, wow, the dark powers deliver. Look what they were able to do. Yeah.
One argument that kind of takes hold with me is people saying, well, it's just popular in Gaza and the West Bank after October 7th and become increasingly popular as they die and try to kill Jews with every step. So, I think eliminating Hamas is a necessity because of what they've done. I don't know that it gets you anywhere. You get Hamas, version 2.0.
Yeah, it is a real problem. And one of the things you'll notice is the Arabs love the Palestinians so much they can't stop talking about it. But they won't take a single one into their countries because they are thinking the same way you are. As long as they're stuck in Gaza, this will happen again and again and again. And one day we'll get to kill all the Jews. Because the obsession with this in the Middle East, again, should not be underestimated. The protocols of the Elders of Zion are taken as gospel in much of the Middle East. There's one king of Saudi Arabia, whenever a foreign leader was going to meet him, they would have to take them aside and say, now, there will come a point in the conversation when he starts telling you that Jews kill Gentile children and Arab children to put their blood into Passover bread. Don't say anything. He'll eventually stop. You can imagine having to brief someone that this is what your ally is going to start doing. So yes, and the idea, well, should they just expel them all from Gaza? No, Israel can't do that. It's not that kind of a society. But everybody would be better off, just about, if the Palestinians went and lived in Arab countries and used their talents for some other purpose. But the Israelis, when they had a problem in Gaza in 2005, and I was actually there at the time, their solution was that they left. Who else would have done that in the entire history of the world? Who would have dealt with that conflict by pulling their own people out and risking a civil war instead of driving out the people who were trying to kill them? But this is the sort of thing that shows you which side Israel is on, and it makes the Palestinians hate them even more, because in their hearts they know. They know what they would have done if they were in a position to do it. I mean, you go right back to 48. What happens in 1948 when Israel's created? The Secretary General of the Arab League predicts a momentous massacre, and they tell the Palestinian Arabs, get out of the way, we'll kill all the Jews, then you can come back. That's the foundation of the whole modern problem. And people normally would say, well, gee, that's kind of a bad thing to do. Under almost any other circumstances, this would be regarded as a significant factor in the conflict. But here it's not. And yet, the Israelis, again, somebody said about the 67 war, it's the first time in history that the people who won an overwhelming victory sued for peace, and those who had lost demanded unconditional surrender. Right after the 67 war, the Arabs get together in Khartoum, and they issue the 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. And then everybody's like, oh, hey, Israelis, make a concession, make a concession, make a concession. They want peace. It's domestic pressure or some such thing like that. And at some point, I can't help thinking that even that attitude among Western statesmen is a morally culpable thing. Because again, think to yourselves, what if the Arabs won the next war and wiped out all the Jews in Israel? What if you did get another genocide? Wouldn't it be difficult to explain why you hadn't been on the side of Israel? I would certainly hope so. I mean, for those people who say mission accomplished, you know who and what they are, but this is, I mean, Israel almost did lose in 73. It was actually very close. And I believe that one of the things that happened afterwards, Israel developed its nuclear weapons program, and it made clear to the Arab rulers, if we ever find ourselves going under, every one of your capital cities gets it, and so do Mecca and Medina. I don't know that, but it's my theory is that they have done that. But Hamas wouldn't care. They think, and the Iranians, they go, well, Allah will stop the bombs in midair. So you are dealing with a very, very difficult situation. And I agree, because I say, I would not say drive them all out of Gaza. I'm not that kind of person either. And hope that maybe as they look at the rubble and the wreckage, some of them are going to say to themselves, that wasn't actually a good idea. But again, what governance structure do you put in place in Gaza? A UN mandate? I mean, I trust the UN as far as I can spit a rat. And the Israelis don't want it. It's such a mess. And then you get some intricate practical questions. When I was in Israel at one point, we were actually so far north, we were looking south at the Golan Heights. In this one little village that was on the corner of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel that had no Jews or Israelis in it. But the Israelis controlled it because neither Syria nor Lebanon would have anything to do with it. And so this is one of these odd little practical details. And these things do arise, there's no question. But And I don't think Netanyahu knows what to do. I mean, that's one of the problems. He knows he has to destroy Hamas, and he has no idea what to do next, and neither does anybody else, except the people who are engaged in wish fulfillment and the people who are engaged in promoting evil. So the sensible people are at a loss, and the idiots and the evil people have a plan. And that's not a good situation, right? That's a really bad situation. But I think if more people in the West, at least in the small number of gray countries there, would just get 100% behind Israel and stop, nagging them and drawing moral equivalence and that kind of stuff, and just say, we're not going to approve of everything you do, but we are with you to the end here, then maybe it would give them a little more room for creative maneuver. Because another thing that I keep seeing, when people keep saying pressure mounts on Israel, right? Pressure is this colorless, odorless gas that makes journalists write headlines. And day after day I read pressure mounts on Israel, Israel more isolated. But if you talk to Israelis, what they'll tell you is, we are completely alone. When the chips are down, nobody is with the Jews except the Jews. So we don't care what the Gentiles say. I mean, it's even David Ben-Gurion said that. It doesn't matter what Gentiles say, it matters what Jews do. And so the more we fail to support them, the less leverage we have over what practical steps they take, because they know that if they need us, we won't be there. I mean, Canada couldn't be there. If Israel really were faced with annihilation, if there was a military crisis going on where the next week was critical, we couldn't send anything. I mean, that literally, I don't think we could get one airplane there. I doubt we could get a frigate there. We could do nothing. The only people who could get there are the British and the Americans and possibly the French to some limited degree. But even if we could, would we? Would you believe that our political leadership would send Canadians to fight and die to save the Jews from another Holocaust? Because I don't. I'm sorry to say that, but I don't. The Americans would. If it came to it, they would send in troops. They would fight and die on the ground in Israel. I think the British would too. But I don't think our leadership would, even if they could. So what do the Israelis care what we think about what they're doing? If you were an Israeli, would you care? Would you regard, I mean, all this never again, we said, never again. Oh, I'm such a good person, never again. And the next time it really comes up, we're like, oh, boo, you Israelis are so mean. It's terrible.
Two observations that are somewhat different, but also related, and then they just reinforce what you said. But Bev and I were in Belfast when this happened, and we did this tour of Belfast with the murals. And so on the Protestant side, you get all these bright painted, KAT, kill all take, kill all the Catholics, and F all papists. But then you go to the opposite side, and it's full of signs. Nelson Mandela, Spanish Civil War, the communists, and Free Palestine. And it's just, the murals are absolutely full of them. And they've somehow linked all of these causes together with Ireland, and the freedom of Ireland from the British and all the rest. And two of my recent ex-residents who are lovely people, they've completely gone whole hog on social media with, you've got to stop this Israeli genocide. It's actually quite disturbing. But I'll tell the other half of my story, which a lot of my co-workers are, over the years, over the last 35 years, are Arabs, doctors, a number of them. And they've shared to me some of where they come from, or some of the ideology. It's interesting, Newfoundland just unveiled a memorial to the Newfoundland Regiment in Turkey, in Gallipoli, in 1915. But the deal was, in exchange, the Turks had to put up a memorial in downtown St. John's. And what shocked a lot of people was, it was not a memorial to the soldiers, it was a memorial to the martyrs, to the Turkish martyrs. And so that was just set up 3 months ago. But one of my doctor friends, his father was in the Jordanian army. And he said, my dad had 3 orders. He said the first, is 67, was attack, drive Israel to the sea. He said the second order was retreat, retreat. And the third order was stand and fight to the death. He said, my dad spent the rest of the war going in and out of his uniform, mingling with the civilian population. And that was how that ended. Another guy who's now in Ottawa, a pretty good friend, he worked for the Americans in the Green Zone in Iraq. And he said those Americans didn't understand. They were trying to do goodwill things. So that his job was to go out outside the Green Zone. He said they'd kill me if they knew what I was doing, so I had to be very careful. But my job was to find kids with congenital heart disease so they could get their hearts repaired. And he said, but the Americans sent them all to Israel to have this done. And he said, they'd kill me if they knew that these kids were being sent to Israel. And another guy said to me, he said, I lived in Toronto 5 years before I came to Labrador. And he said, Robert, he said, I could not walk past a man with a yarmulke without getting tense and upset on the inside. And he said, my whole life I was taught, these people are your enemies, these people want to kill you. And he said, I couldn't get rid of it. Well, actually, I think he did get rid of it, but he said it took me 5 years before I could even relax passing one on the street. So it's very deep-seated ideology. It's really what you just said, right?
Yeah, it's hard to get rid of. And by the way, in his book, The Revenge of Conscience, Jay Budziszewski made a couple of points that I found very, very enlightening, and sort of these things that once you hear them, you think, why didn't I see this before? And I can't now unsee it. And one of them that was interesting, he said that morality is not primarily a matter of feeling. It's a matter of knowledge. We know right from wrong. And how we feel about it is secondary. And it's interesting when someone has been doing something wrong and they get caught, and they will very often say, how could I be so stupid? And what they mean isn't, why didn't I hide it better? They mean, how could I have been so morally stupid? But the other one is just people talk about conscience as though it's a barrier. And you're on the good side and you go up to it and pokey. And at some point you climb over it, jump over it, do something, and you're on the other side. Because it's much more like a spring. If you are on the hole on the right side and you start approaching the barrier, it compresses more as you get closer to it and it pushes back harder. It gets harder and harder to get to that point. But once you're on the other side, the same thing operates in reverse. The further you are from it, the more comfortable you are. But if you try to approach it to get back over it, it compresses and shoves you back in the wrong direction. And so, yes, people have had their minds poisoned. And it's remarkable the degree to which this happens, including one of the interesting things about ethnic conflict is when you run into one that you don't share, it looks preposterous. And I think I told the story about Sassenachs, right? Yeah, well, as those of you who are deeply immersed in Scottish nationalism will know, Sassenach is an insulting Scottish term for the English. And the English could care less, right? Because they think the Scots are a bunch of hairy barbarians covered in blue paint, that you have to build walls to keep them out. But it turns out that Sassenach is actually a Gaelic word, and it is a term of abuse from Highland Scots to Lowland Scots, and it means Saxon. And again, this is where having been an oppressed Scot and half of me all my life, I suddenly discovered that actually my Lowland Scots ancestors are the descendants of these terrible Saxons who came and slaughtered everybody and tried to burn civilization to the ground, which I'm not that proud of. But again, even though I know the Sassenach thing, it's just a petty thing to say. Or and you go into some third world country and two ethnic groups you couldn't tell apart from a distance, think each other are the worst people on the planet over what? But once it takes hold, it really does take hold. I mean, the Ulster issue, talk about historical problems I can't solve. And in some sense, my sympathies lie with Ulster because that is sort of my antecedents of those kinds of people, though, from England and Scotland. But on the other hand, in England's whole history, it never had a more deplorable colonial venture than Ireland, and I know this to be true. So that's a tough one where I have some sympathy for both sides. But when one side starts flying Hamas flags, it's very hard to retain much sympathy for the entire mental mindset. On the other hand, more volunteers from Ireland, Southern Ireland, fought in the British Army in World War II than ever served in the IRA. So you see that a whole lot of people didn't lose the plot despite all of that. But again, it is funny, and you think about, you could go to some South American country, say, and find regional animosities that would just baffle you, and yet they're quite real to the people there. I mean, my kids are so woke now that you can't tell a Newfie joke. But but again, the idea that anyone, well, I remember actually, it's an interesting story that when I was in high school, we were studying a bit of the history of the United States and the immigration of the Irish and how they were despised and people thought they lived in holes in the ground and so on. And there was a girl in our class who was of Irish descent, just like the rest of us. And we were all like, well, that's amazing. You live in a hole in the ground? We never knew that. But the joke was, how could anybody despise the Irish? Like what? I couldn't get started. And yet, yeah, and so then when I think of what people in the Middle East are told about Jews, or even what, I remember when I was quite a kid, a friend of my parents at the University of Toronto, they commented bitterly. They said, well, they would have made him chancellor for sure, except he's Jewish. And they were very offended by this anti-Semitism. But at the time, it was just taken for granted. We shall not have a Jew be head of the university. So, that stuff was common even in polite society, even people who would have certainly thought Hitler was vulgar, if nothing else. And it is, but yes, it can get a hold of you, and it can be very, very hard to shake off this conviction that certain kinds of people are absolutely not to be trusted. Would you want your daughter to marry one? Actually, I had one of my ancestors back in the ancestral village in Scotland married a Catholic, and he had to leave town. That was it for him, right? Out he went. But it's so pathological in the Middle East. And again, anti-Semitism is not like other hatreds. Like, I'm not in favor of hatreds, and I could say a lot about racism against blacks and all kinds of other forms of hatred. But hatred of God's chosen people has a special edge to it, because it is, I don't care how secular a Jewish person is, I don't care how little regard they have for the stories in what we call the Old Testament, how readily they would eat shrimp wrapped in bacon. They are a reminder to everybody that there is one God, omniscient, omnipotent, and really, really disgusted with what a mean person you are, although he will forgive you if you absolutely are sorry. And so the most natural thing in the world is to kill the messenger. And the trouble with being Jewish from the point of view of someone who just thinks it doesn't matter at all is that the anti-Semites think it matters. As I said, when I was in Israel, on this trip with the journalists, one of them was a Canadian columnist who was the most secular Jew you could ever meet. He was Jewish by descent, but not observant, not a believer, married to a non-Jew, didn't keep kosher, any of that. But she realized at Yad Vashem, she said, you know what? They don't care how Jewish I think I am. They care how Jewish they think I am. And this was an eye-opener to her. But it is, again, it's another part of the story that this is not just one more hatred, irrational as they all are. This is hatred of Jews for being Jews. And anti-Semitism, if you try and describe it any other way, you miss the point of it. And then you have to say, well, why would someone hate Jews in particular? What is it about Jews? Is it that they eat gefilte fish? No. I had a Jewish friend one time telling me how great gefilte fish was, and I got some, and I went to him and I said, you know what this is? This is leftovers. I said, you all think this is good because you had this warm, close family life, and this was all there was to eat. But it is not actually good. It's like haggis. It can be done right, but this is not in the world's top 10 dishes. It just can't be. Shortbread I'll defend. Haggis, not so much. But again, people hate Jews for Judaism, and not for what is bad about it, but for what is good about it. And that is why anti-Semitism is inseparable from evil in other forms.
Switching gears just a little bit, you were talking about how Rome was right for Christianity, but then a lot of people also say a big cause of the Roman decline and the eventual collapse was moral decay. Can you talk about that some?
Well, I mean, the Republic, they thought, collapsed because of moral decay pre-Christian. But the question with the empire, I mean, so Augustine, of course, wrote a whole book like, no, it wasn't us. Did Rome go soft because of Christianity? Because, I mean, it's not moral decay in the strict sense, right? The Christians were more upright in their conduct than the rest of the Romans had become. But the question was, were they too meek and mild and otherworldly and turning the other cheek? But I don't think so. I mean, even early on, there was one Christian legion. There's one legion that was notorious for the Christians joining it, and part of the point was it was no less determined and no less skilled than the others. The Roman Empire falls apart for all kinds of reasons. But on the other hand, and again, I made this argument in class, in some sense, Rome never did fall. I mean, Byzantium, of course, persists until 1453, though it's looking pretty mangy toward the end. But in a very real sense, Christendom, the West, Rome, survives. The development of feudalism is an improvement on the political system. For one thing, instead of getting stuck with Nero or Caligula or something, you have a whole lot of feudal lords bound by mutual ties, and you can get to the next principality fairly easily if you need to. It remains Christian, it develops economically, it develops militarily. So in a very real sense, Rome never did fall. I mean, and in fact, the final sack of Rome was just a formality, right? They'd already moved the capital anyway, nobody cared. But the political system continues to gain strength, the economic system, the cultural system, such that, again, look at the great countries, right? I mean, you think, where would I like to live in the world? Where could I really live in the world? And the answer is in the Roman Empire, including the places that were settled by things that were part of the Roman Empire, but minus the stuff that Islam cut off, because that really had a damaging effect. And where would I not want to live? Outside the Roman Empire. Even Germany, actually, apparently Konrad Adenauer in the 20s, whenever he crossed the Elbe to go to the parliament in Berlin, he would mutter, "Now we're in Asia." And unfortunately, because of bad old Herman or Arminius, the Romans got stopped at the Rhine. And it's a shame they did. I think the world would be a better place if all of Germany had been brought under the sway of Rome. It was actually one of those great moments in nationalism that wasn't so great. So the political, technical fact that the Roman emperor ceased to rule in Rome, I mean, there's the Venerable Bede at one point who talks about somebody being the 26th emperor of Rome. It didn't occur to him that Rome had fallen. It's like, well, that's interesting. We were all like, oh yeah, one day Rome was up, the next day it was down. But the civilization of Western Europe and then moving into England and getting all this stuff going does not seem to me to have been a disaster. It seems to me to have been a very successful enterprise. In fact, in the end, Byzantium's the disaster. Byzantium just doesn't quite get that Western flame of liberty.
Another thought about what you said earlier about the Greeks and the Romans not really having like a consistent canon or like an understanding of the afterlife. So then I'm thinking of Plato's Republic, because it seems like Socrates didn't necessarily think very highly of all the, he kind of seemed like he knew that a lot of this was mythology and he was kind of advancing to the next stage and reason and that kind of thing. But he talks about going to some town in Plato's Republic and some bard is singing some song about some god, and he's like, "Oh, this is great! I never heard this before. That was really cool. Thanks, bard." And it's like they're just kind of, "Oh, okay. Well, this place has this myth, and that place has that myth." And then at the end of Plato's Republic, then he talks about some guy that had a near-death experience, and everybody's at the end of their life, and they're drawing different straws, and Ulysses even comes up, Odysseus, and he says, "I really love a simple life as a farmer. I had way too much action in my last life." And then somebody's like, "I really hope I get a life as like a bald eagle or whatever kind of eagle." So the good people went up and they had a life in the heavens, and the bad people went down and had to go through the afterlife and atone for their sins. Was that seen anywhere else in the Greek world, or is that just kind of like some kind of new age thought that Plato is having and this happened?
Well, again, part of the problem is that we have very few sources from that period, right? Much of what was written didn't survive, and what was written by a very small and unusual group of people. So trying to figure out from Socrates and his belief in his personal kind of daemon and Socrates sometimes seems to be a monotheist. But one other thing, I do talk about this again in the course, where I look at various sources, some of whom seem clear there is no afterlife, others seem equally sure there is, and others admit that the matter is completely obscure. So what did the Greeks think about the afterlife? And then what did the Greek who didn't write the Odyssey think about the afterlife? What did the average Greek schlep who's going around just minding his own or her own business? They may well have had a very different view than anything that any philosopher would have held. And they may well have thought that philosophers were a bunch of nitwits who'd look at the stars and fall down a well, which is not a totally unreasonable view. So that makes it enormously hard. Nobody ever Actually, it's a bit of a sideline, but one time at U of O, I taught a course on slavery, and the United States mostly. And one of the things I discovered is that at the beginning of the New Deal, one of the many projects cooked up by Franklin and Roosevelt's idealists and bright young people was that they got a bunch of college students to go and talk to ex-slaves and actually ask them what it had been like. And this was a very distorted sample because these would all have been people who were kids under slavery and of course were long-lived, so they were an unusual selection. But it was the first time anybody ever went and asked the slaves. So you look back at the classic slave memoirs and what you get is these extraordinary people like Frederick Douglass, absolutely outstanding individuals in a whole range of ways. And so when they go and talk to these ordinary people, one of the things that they came through was that the shoes didn't fit. Right? And this was a source of constant misery because they're working hard physical labor most of the time and the shoes just never fit. And there's a wide range. Some people said, oh, our master wasn't too bad, or, you know, our master was kind of obnoxious, or our master was so evil, slavery was hell. You get a whole range, but I remember one of them says to the interviewer, nobody's ever asked me about my life before. And so, and I remember this other guy who was talking about the spirituals and how they had this religious meaning, but also were kind of sometimes a bit political talking. He says, you know, going to meeting might mean that a bunch of slaves are getting together at night to talk about something. And then at the end he says, but I'm not going to sing them to you because I've forgotten most of the words and my voice is like the bray of a mule. Lovely. But again, you know, nobody ever did this for average Greeks or Romans. Nobody ever went and asked them, what is your life like? What do you eat in the course of a day? What do you think about the afterlife? What do you think about the emperor? Did you know there was an emperor? And so we're reconstructing from very limited material what they thought about religion. But again, I'm going to come back to the fact that most people have this written on the human heart sense that the universe must contain justice somewhere. And that sooner or later, somehow or other, there's going to be a reckoning. Even the Egyptians had this thing where you got your heart weighed, and if it went down, the great devourer ate it. And I suspect that this was reflected in folk belief to a large degree, that people didn't think, yeah, Pharaoh gets to live in a nice house, I get to live in a mud hut, and then he goes up and gets to be a god, and I just die. People are probably thinking, no, he's going to get a surprise. And I mean, it's a society that mummified cats by the millions, which is kind of odd too.
John, I want to thank you for this presentation tonight. It's good. I've enjoyed it. But I'd like you to perhaps end on a hopeful note with regard to the Middle East. Where do you see it's going? I think everybody's pushing a two-state system. They've tried it. It doesn't work.
Well, no, everybody in the West is pushing a two-state solution. A lot of Israelis are pushing a two-state solution.
And some aren't.
Yeah, some aren't. But in the Muslim Middle East and the Palestinian territories, they're pushing, if they want that, it's only as a springboard for the final conquest. And so I think Israel basically, as they did when they pulled out of Gaza, they need to deal with the problem and then take care of their own security arrangements. There is no partner for peace, but there can be this sort of armed vigilance if you destroy the monster, and then if another one comes up, you go after it. But
honestly, Hamas is more than military power. It's more than soldiers. It's an ideology that they have given to their children. Even 4-year-olds are acting it out in kindergarten schools. The hatred of Jews, it goes through the generations, and that has to be dealt with.
yeah, I mean, and again, my simple solution for many of life's problems is, you know, we need a real Christian revival. We need that here in Canada, and clearly they need it in the Middle East. They need to turn away from the groves. And I don't know how to make them do it, but God has plans that are mightier and more subtle than I can imagine. And so that's where the hope lies, that they accept Christ as their Savior. I mean, I realize that doesn't sound like a great practical plan, but then again, the two-state solution hasn't really performed well in practice either. And if we're going to dream, we might as well dream big, right?
Israeli talks about a one-state integration. He talks about planting Jews and Palestinian villages inside Gaza and building it up from grassroots again, but as an integrated state.
But the trouble is that the Israeli villages will be under constant siege by their neighbors. I mean, look, it's bad enough when you've got a wall.
The war didn't work.
Well, I mean, compared to what? It didn't work perfectly, but it worked a lot better than the alternatives, and this world is full of imperfect contrivances. I don't have a way to talk peace to people who believe that exterminating the Jews will bring about the return of the Mahdi. I just don't. And you know, again, what was the solution to Nazi Germany? Well, first we wipe out the regime. And so I think that you start with that, and you hope that somebody somewhere has a different attitude in the aftermath of it all, that there are people in Gaza who can't speak their minds, but who know that this wasn't right, that this didn't work out, that it was in principle not the kind of thing that you want to be part of. And I suspect that there are some such people. And again, if you worship strength and what you get is weakness and disaster, at some point people say the demons didn't keep the bargain. Where's our victory? Where are all the dead Jews? We didn't get what we paid for. And so maybe that's the way in. But as I say, I mean, in a sense, my solution, and it's only a partial one, is in my title, Hamas Delenda. That has to be done with a thoroughness that the Romans destroyed Carthage, with a seriousness of purpose and the completeness of execution. And then we see what comes next. But if we don't do that, we're right back where we started. And I noticed, by the way, the Americans built a pier to bring relief into Gaza, and then a storm broke it up, and now they're taking the bits away. It's like, I'm from the government and here to help. But that's like, okay, that's sort of a metaphor for the whole thing, the whole of the well-meaning Western idealists. And on that hopeful note, which it wasn't, I think we'll conclude this, and then we can just continue to talk. And thank you all very much. And please fight those principalities and powers with everything you have.